Hello and welcome to, I guess, the final episode of Mordred's Community Multiplayer Europa Universalis, Season 2. Joined as always by my co-host, Martian. Martian, how's it going?
Pretty good. Nice to be here.
Overall, thoughts on Season 2?
It was really good. I think all around we saw players get a lot better, and we had some good wars. Might have been slow at moments, but all in all, really good season.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought the New World was a little more interesting this season than last. I think we still have some challenges with Asia and the players there, the isolation and the balance. So that'll be something I'm interested in fixing moving forward. But I thought Europe was a little less crowded this season, and it was a little more interesting. But otherwise, yeah, I'd like to figure out how to fix Asia, and
Mm.
we'll see. But besides that, I had a blast, and I'm appreciative of everyone in the community who spent their Saturdays with us and fought it out on the battlefields across Europe, Asia, Africa, etc. And looking forward to our next season. So,
Yeah.
I'd like to get your thoughts on a few different categories here. I want to make some shout outs for the player we feel MVP, most impact on the game, that sort of role, um, most improved from when we started the session till where we are right now at the end of the season, and then also best sportsmanship because as we know, EU4 can be a tough game and things don't always go your way. But I'd like to recognize players who stuck it out. So I, I actually have two people for a couple of the categories. So I'll throw it over to you first. Um, we'll start with most improved from 1444 to 1723. Who surprised you the most this season?
I think I mean, all across the board there was improvement. I think every single player got better, but I think the player that stands out the most is Mind Boy. I mean, we've had a lot of seasons where Mind Boy kind of just got tossed around and just didn't look so good, but he built up a really good nation this game in a very tricky spot to stay alive, and yet here he was at the end of the game. And at the end of our last session, he even managed to become a great power, and I think just huge testament to his growth as a player.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm gonna go in a different direction here. I'm gonna recognize Dominic over in Portugal. Um, Zale and I were worried early on that he was going too slow. He wasn't colonizing quick enough, and by the end of it, he got picked on a little bit by Great Britain. That's bound to happen, but from where he was in the early 1500s to where he ended up in 1700, I'm quite impressed with what Dominic was able to do and the growth he showed as a player over the course of the season.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'll kick the next one off. We'll go with best sport. I got to recognize two people here. One, Mind Boy. His Bavaria became the dominant battleground in Europe in the late sessions, and he hung in there, never complained through every war, even though battles were being fought in his land and he wasn't the direct target, etc. And then I gotta recognize Just Dutch. Um, Hung around as the Mughals or Timurids, got carved up at times, kept showing up, and kept having fun. Never heard him complain. Um, yeah, so my best sport goes to Mine Boy and Just Dutch.
Yeah. I think for me, the player that stood out the most was Duel. They had a time, playing in Kilwa and fought, war against all of the great powers of the game and stuck it out and made them fight for every inch. And that was such an entertaining session because, I mean, everyone had so much fun because of the fact that Duel stayed in there and had good spirits about it. And then Duel later went on to play as Keimer and occupied my capital in the middle of a huge war, which was super entertaining, made for lots of fun just because they were willing to stick in there with some tough spots.
Oh, that's another good one. I like that. And now for MVP or most impactful, what do you got?
I mean, I'm torn in ways, but I think it would either be France or Hungary. I think for most of the game, Hungary dictated how a lot of the diplomacy got set up, how lots of the nations interacted, and then France did a great job of trying to shatter that as often as possible. And it created a really fun dynamic throughout the game. I tried my best to keep the peace and keep everything together, and you kept adding in lots of fun with different wars, and it just helped keep the game lively. So
I'm going to go in a slightly different direction here, and I think we would have had a different conversation on this one had Curb stuck it out as Ruthenia. It became a pretty dominant country, but it's difficult when switching perms and all that. So I'm actually going to recognize Panda with Great Britain. Um, we've always had fairly colonial focused Great Britons, and Panda decided to play things a little bit differently this season. Went into the continent aggressively. Um, he was the first to take down, or maybe the second to take down another player, but moved aggressively against Sweden. He took on a large coalition to break things up in the HRE early in one session. He wasn't afraid to switch up his diplomacy, moving against Portugal, even though he had worked closely with Spain for much of the game, fought in India, uh, fought all over the map. So I appreciated what Panda was able to do with Great Britain, even though his colonial prowess was a little bit cheesy with the way he went about it.
yeah, certainly.
And now we'll switch from a war perspective. What was your favorite war of season two? Doesn't have to be one you were in, just your opinion.
I will say I think there's two that stick out for me. One was Kilwa fighting. Was it France, Portugal, Spain, and GB?
Yep.
Um, that I mean that was crazy to listen to, crazy to watch, super entertaining. And from a slightly more biased point, I have to say the 1v1 between me and you was so entertaining because it happened after the 1723 in our final session. It was just duking it out, throwing hundreds of thousands of troops into the battlefield, and it always those last session wars are always super fun because you kind of there's not as much of a downside if you lose a war, and so you just get to really enjoy the game.
Yeah, I my second war against Ireland, where it was me and you versus Ireland and Spain, I think was the most fun for me. I was able to get that discipline event and push relatively hard, but um, that war was a lot of fun. It put myself, Spain, and Ireland all in quite a bit of debt with
Hmm.
manpower drained, but it was a knockout, knockdown type brawl. I had a blast in that war.
Yeah, definitely.
So, moving forward, I know we've got Anne Benar coming up this weekend. We'll be returning to vanilla, or maybe vanilla with a light quality of life mod in future seasons. If you changed one thing or changed a couple of things, what would it be to improve things moving forward?
Um, I think we. I mean, I think there was a lot of good with this. I think the player seating was a little weird, but I think that largely just came down to the number of people we had, and it's kind of hard to foresee this being the end game. I think there were a few players that were definitely expected to stay around, which I think is good, though. I mean, to be able to have things like that, and not have as stale of a game as you might naturally assume is nice. But I think it'd be definitely nice to get a few more people involved, just so we can make sure that everyone has stuff to do.
Yep, agreed. It is tough to strike a balance, I think, because we were a little bit smaller on the player count perspective. I think Asia got the shaft, as I mentioned before. Um, just not a whole lot of content there because the players were spaced relatively far apart. Um,
Mhm.
so it'll be interesting to see if we can maybe get to that 25 player number in future sessions so that we can have a little more interesting seating. And then
Yeah.
Um, how did you feel about the diplomacy in the player alliance limits and that aspect of the game?
There were a lot of moments where it was kind of awkward. Like you'd have players like Bavaria not be able to have allies, and then you'd have, one and two great power allied, and it just, I mean, while I don't think the rules were necessarily horrible in this particular situation, it felt awkward through a lot of the game, and I think there were lots of moments where it paused any warfare just because of the fact that the alliance rules just kind of made it impossible for someone to move without instantly getting killed. So
Yeah, it's tough. There was definitely some periods of Cold War in Europe where I think people wanted to fight wars, but they felt if they were the first to declare, others may pile onto them. So by declaring that war, you were setting yourself up to get ganked. Um, Luckily, I think we broke out of that a little bit towards the later part of the season, but yeah, it was interesting at times with how it just felt like the person to make the first move was going to be the person to die.
yeah,
And then, with regards to colonial nations, obviously we'll probably be making a change around vassals being able to take colonial ideas, but other than that, any feedback on how things went? Did New Württemberg make an outsized impact? Would you limit anything or change anything, Im- improve anything to spice things up in the colonial landscape?
I think in order to spice up that region more, you really just have to have more players. Because obviously, if you compared, filling out a colonial region versus filling out Asia, you're going to want to fill out Asia first. And so I think until we get a little bit of a larger base, I think this isn't bad. But it was kind of relatively inconsequential. There was a bit more movement than last season, but the movement didn't really do as much even then. Even with France getting the Colombian colony, it still didn't shake things up a whole lot. So
Do you think we could see an Aztec or an Inca player, or is that just setting them up for slaughter once the colonizers arrive?
I mean, it all depends on Diplo, really. I mean, if you have the players wanting to do that, that can work. We saw how Alaska worked last season. As long as you have people willing to stick with that player, it can work. But at the same time, it is a lot more vulnerable than most nations, and you definitely need a very good player in order to do that. And I
Well,
think once we have the new expansion, I think that might be worth looking into a lot more. Whenever they kind of refine the natives and make have that a little bit more content there. So
yeah, that's a good point. Hopefully, 131 will be out when we return to vanilla. Hoping to do another miners game, but maybe not pack everyone into Europe. So expand it a little bit, just because I think that the miners allows for some interesting tags to be formed, and a little more dynamic action early game. Um,
mhm.
but any final thoughts as we wrap up the season?
No, I think it was. I mean, it was. We made the best out of it. I had some concerns at the beginning with how few players we had, but it ended up being really good and really fun for everyone. So
Well, I appreciate you and look forward to continuing these videos as we move into Anbanar.
yeah.
Have a good one.